Hello, today is Friday, January 29th, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. This year, here in the US, a new president and a new administration arrived in Washington, bringing with them a new agenda for telecommunications and technology issues. Many of the items on the agenda will directly and indirectly affect large enterprise customers. Fortunately, on today's podcast, I'm joined by two of my LB3 colleagues who are also top Washington, D.C. regulatory gurus. With me are Jeff Sheldon and Sara Crifasi, and they are going to walk us through some of the big ticket items that they expect to take center stage in Washington in the upcoming months and years. Hey, Sara. Hey, Jeff. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Joe.
Yes, thanks, Joe. Nice to be here.
Okay, Sara, let me start with you. With the change in administration, do you expect to see any significant changes at the FCC?
Yes, but not right away. So right now, the FCC is operating without a full bench. It's supposed to have 5 commissioners, 3 from the president's party and 2 from the other party. So while Republicans held a 3-2 majority during the Trump administration, the balance should shift in the opposite direction soon. But right now, there's a 2-2 stalemate since the previous chairman resigned. To break that deadlock, President Biden needs to nominate and the Senate must confirm a new commissioner. Now, on January 21st, President Biden did name one of the current commissioners, Jessica Rosenworcel, as the new acting chair. So the nominee could be a new commissioner or could be appointed as chair, in which case they'd have broader authority to guide policy direction. In any case, until we have a new majority and until the next chair has time to set his or her priorities, don't expect any major policy shifts or big decisions.
So, Jeff, without knowing today who the new chair is, do you have any ideas about what issues we can expect the commission to focus on this year?
We can look at a few big ticket items. The beginning of implementation of toll-free access reform, broadband expansion and 5G, the increasing USF contribution factor, and the ongoing net neutrality debate. As Sara and I will explain, some of these goals transcend political parties. On some issues, there's agreement on the direction, but not the means. And on other issues, there are fundamental differences on the issue itself.
Hey, so you mentioned toll-free access reform. Why don't you explain what that is? And can you also tell me what's going to be happening this year?
Sure, Joe. So toward the end of 2020, the FCC reformed the pricing system for how carriers compensate each other to terminate toll-free calls. And this affects how much enterprise customers have to pay for their toll-free service. The FCC's reform transitions the inter-carrier charges that apply to those toll-free calls, known as toll-free access charges, from around 0.75 cents down to 0 over the next 3 years. And what that means for enterprises, as some of the nation's largest toll-free customers, is that one of the major cost inputs underlying toll-free services will be falling dramatically, ultimately going away. But this doesn't mean that prices for your toll-free services will also fall. Carriers love to pass through cost increases resulting from regulatory decisions, but they don't pass cost reductions through unless they're mandated or incentivized to do so. Still, enterprises can use knowledge of these changes to begin to negotiate for savings from toll-free providers.
That's very interesting. So, Jeff, you also highlighted expansion of broadband. Now, I think this pandemic really has kind of put a spotlight on how critical broadband access is with requirements for things like remote learning and work from home. Do you have any idea whether more will be done to promote broadband expansion, including 5G service?
Right, Joe. Broadband is one of those issues that everyone can agree on at a high level, but we could see some changes in how the FCC defines broadband in terms of minimum data rates, and there could be changes in how the FCC subsidizes broadband services. For example, whether they should promote expansion into underserved areas or whether to subsidize rates for low-income users everywhere. We could also see some tightening of environmental regulations that the FCC relaxed in recent years to facilitate broadband construction, as well as FCC returning more control to the state and local governments to regulate broadband construction. We anticipate the FCC is going to continue releasing more spectrum for 5G through auctions, and for license-free use. And both of these would allow carriers to offer more wireless broadband options, particularly in urban centers, and create opportunities for enterprises to build private 5G systems for things like IoT or campus networks using the same basic technologies that the carriers are deploying.
And then there is the Universal Service Fund assessment, that pesky assessment that just seems to keep going higher and higher. So, Sarah, what is the factor now, and is it likely to keep going up under this new administration?
Well, once again, the current USF contribution factor has hit an all-time high. We saw 31.8% last quarter. This is a 17% increase from the prior quarter's contribution factor. And unless the FCC adopts significant reform to the contributions methodology, the factor will continue to rise because the system is based on assessing carrier revenues for services that are in steep decline, mainly long-distance voice. So as demands increase for the fund to spend more money and the base of revenues assessed to fund those expenditures decrease, the contribution factor will just continue dramatically increasing. We've been sounding the alarm about this for over a decade, but the FCC has avoided doing much of anything about it. But a 31.8% factor is just hard to ignore, and we expect that the FCC will have to take it up this year. The question becomes what replaces it? Tax purely on businesses, funding from general tax revenues. There are a number of ideas currently on the table, and there's a lot of money involved, so it's an important issue for enterprise customers to track.
So, on these podcasts, we've talked about net neutrality, and it's been a political football for at least the last 5 years. So, do you think we're going to hear more about it with this new administration?
Yeah, Joe, net neutrality is one of those issues that just won't go away. So, yeah, the debate is likely going to be resurrected, but it's doubtful the FCC will want to tackle this again without strong congressional support. The original concern, as you remember, was that ISPs would control their networks to favor their own content, or that they would double dip by charging content providers for preferential access to consumers. However, more recently, these concerns have been somewhat overshadowed by whether social media platforms, which are unregulated, can or should be able to control content. And even though there's little evidence that ISPs have engaged in anti-competitive practices even after the net neutrality rules were eliminated. Now, the acting FCC chair, Jessica Rosenworcel, has been a fierce advocate for strong rules on net neutrality, so we can be sure that she will be diligently watching for evidence of anti-competitive conduct by the ISPs. But in the end, this issue, or the issue of social media platforms, will probably be settled only if Congress gives the FCC better authority to address internet issues.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Do you have any final thoughts on what users should expect in the coming year?
Well, as a generalization, Democratic administrations have historically been more aggressive in using regulation and less inclined to rely on the promise of competition to achieve policy outcomes. So far, there's no reason to believe that the Biden administration would be any different. There has been bipartisan consensus that we need more broadband deployment and that spectrum should be freed up for new uses, including 5G, but the differences have emerged in exactly how to achieve these goals. Priorities will be set by the new FCC chair, but we can generally assume that a Biden FCC will be motivated to ratchet back the prior FCC's actions, deregulate industry, or to preempt state and local regulation.
So, Sarah, I bet you work on these issues regularly with LB3's clients who are members of the Ad Hoc Telecom Users Committee. Is that right?
Yes, Joe, that's right. So for those who don't know, Ad Hoc is a group of large enterprise customers that engages in major policy proceedings at the FCC that affect the cost of network services for end users. We work with our members to influence regulatory outcomes and help them understand how to turn those outcomes into cost savings. And aside from monitoring regulatory activities, we also keep members informed on market developments related to current technologies, vendor practices, and sourcing strategies. So if you care about these issues and are interested in discussing your regulatory compliance concerns with other enterprise customers, it's a great organization.
That's a good plug for ad hoc. Thank you for that, Sarah. And Jeff, thanks for your time today as well. Now, as you heard, there is a lot happening in Washington. So if you'd like more information on any of these topics that we discussed today, please reach out to Sarah, Jeff, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected. You can check out our websites and you can follow us on LinkedIn.